The silence in the parking lot stretched on for what felt like hours as the bikers stood frozen, unsure how to respond to the challenge the Navy SEAL had just presented to them. The gang leader looked around at his crew and could see that everything had changed. The respect and fear that had held the group together was crumbling, replaced by shame and the uncomfortable realization that they had been living their lives as bullies rather than the warriors they pretended to be. Then, in a moment that would be talked about for years to come, the massive gang leader did something that shocked everyone watching from inside the restaurant. He reached into the pocket of his leather jacket and pulled out a thick roll of cash held together with a rubber band. Without saying a word, he knelt down beside the injured dog and placed all of his money on the pavement next to the small animal. "For the vet bills," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "and for food and whatever else he needs." One by one, the other bikers began to follow their leader's example. They emptied their pockets of cash, placing crumpled bills and loose change in a growing pile beside the dog. Some of them mumbled apologies that were probably the first genuine words of regret they had spoken in years. Others simply left their money in silence, unable to find words for what they were feeling. The youngest member of the gang, a man who could not have been more than 25 years old, actually knelt down and gently touched the dog's head with one finger. Tears were running down his face as he whispered an apology to the animal that would never be able to understand his words, but seemed to sense his genuine remorse. The retired Navy SEAL watched this transformation with the same calm expression he had maintained throughout the entire confrontation. He could see that his words had accomplished something that violence never could have achieved. These men had been forced to confront the reality of their actions and make a choice about who they wanted to be going forward. When the last of the bikers had added his contribution to the pile of money, the gang leader stood up and faced the Navy SEAL one final time. The arrogance and aggression that had defined him when he arrived that morning were completely gone, replaced by something that might have been the beginning of wisdom. "We will not bother this dog again," he said, his voice carrying a sincerity that surprised everyone who heard it. "And we will spread the word to other clubs about what happened here today, about what real strength looks like." The Navy SEAL nodded once, accepting the promise without comment. He knew that some of these men would probably return to their old ways within a few days or weeks, but he also knew that others had been genuinely changed by what they had experienced. Sometimes that was the best you could hope for. The bikers walked back to their motorcycles in complete silence, their earlier swagger replaced by thoughtful, subdued movements. They started their engines, but the thunderous roar that had announced their arrival was somehow muted now, as if even the machines could sense the change in their riders' attitudes. As the motorcycles disappeared down the street, the Navy SEAL carefully picked up the injured dog and carried him toward the restaurant entrance. The pile of money they had left behind contained several $100s, more than enough to pay for medical treatment and food for months to come. Inside the restaurant, customers burst into spontaneous applause as the quiet hero entered with the rescued animal in his arms. Sarah, the waitress, immediately called the veterinarian. She had been thinking about contacting for weeks, and within an hour the little dog was receiving professional medical care for the first time in his life. The story of what happened that Sunday morning spread quickly through the city and eventually across the internet. People shared it on social media, and news stations picked it up as a human interest story. But the retired Navy SEAL, whose name was never revealed to the public, quietly returned to his normal life, never seeking recognition for what he had done. The little brown and white dog made a complete recovery and was adopted by Maria, the cook who had been leaving food scraps for him. He lived out the rest of his days as a beloved pet, never knowing that his suffering had led to a moment of transformation that inspired thousands of people to stand up for those who could not stand up for themselves. And somewhere out there, 12 men rode their motorcycles with a different understanding of what it meant to be truly strong. The retired Navy SEAL was not finished with the motorcycle gang yet. While they stood in uncomfortable silence, he walked over to where the injured dog was still lying on the pavement, whimpering softly from the pain of his wounds. The former military man knelt down beside the small animal with the same gentle care he might show to a wounded comrade, his large hands moving slowly and carefully as he checked for serious injuries. "Come over here," he said to the bikers, his voice carrying the tone of someone who expected to be obeyed without question. "All of you, I want you to see what your idea of fun actually looks like up close." Reluctantly, the gang members moved closer to where the Navy SEAL was examining the dog. From a distance, they had been able to treat the animal as just an object for their entertainment, but now they were forced to confront the reality of what they had done. The little dog was shaking with pain and fear, his brown eyes wide with confusion about why these humans had hurt him when all he had wanted was friendship. The former SEAL began to speak while he continued his gentle examination of the dog's injuries. His voice was steady and controlled, but there was an underlying intensity that made every word hit home with devastating effect. He explained to the bikers what real strength looked like, and it had nothing to do with hurting creatures that could not defend themselves. "In my 20 years of military service, I met some of the toughest men and women on earth," he said, his hands never stopping their careful check of the dog's condition. "Real warriors, people who had faced death and saved lives in the most dangerous places you can imagine. And do you know what every single one of them had in common? They used their strength to protect those who needed protection, not to cause pain for entertainment." He looked up at the gang leader, and his eyes carried a disappointment that was somehow worse than anger. A truly strong person walks away from fights they do not need to have. They stand up for others who cannot stand up for themselves. They show kindness to animals and children, and anyone who is smaller or weaker than they are. That is what real strength looks like. The Navy SEAL returned his attention to the injured dog, speaking softly to calm the frightened animal while he continued his examination. Several of the bikers found themselves genuinely listening to his words, perhaps for the first time in years hearing someone talk about honor and courage in a way that actually made sense. "This little dog has been living in this parking lot for weeks," the former SEAL continued. "The people who work in that restaurant have been feeding him and caring for him because they understand what it means to be kind to something that needs help. He never hurt anyone, never threatened anyone, never did anything except hope that someone might share a little food or show him a moment of affection." The gang leader shifted uncomfortably, realizing that his crew was listening to this stranger with the kind of attention they usually reserve for his own orders. But unlike his usual commands, which were based on fear and intimidation, this man's words carried the weight of genuine wisdom and experience. "Every one of you chose to hurt this innocent creature because you thought it would make you look tough in front of your friends," the Navy SEAL said, his voice growing quieter but somehow more powerful. "But all you really proved is that you are cowards who can only feel strong when you are picking on something that cannot fight back." Several of the younger bikers were now openly hanging their heads in shame. They had joined the gang because they wanted to be part of something that felt powerful and important, but this man was showing them that what they had actually become was pathetic and cruel. The former SEAL finished his examination of the dog and determined that while the animal was in pain and would need medical attention, there did not appear to be any broken bones or internal injuries that would threaten his life. The little dog seemed to sense that this human was trying to help him, and he had stopped whimpering, though he was still shaking with fear and pain. "This dog is going to survive what you did to him," the Navy SEAL said, standing up slowly and looking around at each of the bikers. "But the question is, are you going to learn anything from this experience? Or are you going to go back to being the same cowards you were when you arrived here this morning?" What happened next was unlike anything the bikers had ever experienced in their years of intimidating people and causing trouble. The retired Navy SEAL did not need to throw a single punch or make any physical threats to completely destroy their confidence and sense of power. Instead, he used something far more effective than violence: the psychological warfare techniques he had learned during his military service. The former SEAL began to speak in the same calm, steady voice he had used throughout the confrontation, but now his words cut through the bikers like a sharp knife. He started by addressing each member of the gang individually, describing their body language and identifying their weaknesses with the precision of someone trained to assess threats and vulnerabilities in seconds. "You," he said, pointing to a biker on his left, "are trying to look tough, but your left hand is shaking, and you keep shifting your weight from foot to foot. That tells me you are scared and looking for a way out of this situation." He turned to another gang member. "And you have been edging backward for the past 2 minutes, putting more distance between us every time you think no one is looking. Your brain is already telling you to run, even if your pride has not caught up yet." One by one, the Navy SEAL went around the circle, reading each biker like an open book. He pointed out nervous habits, defensive postures, and signs of fear that the men themselves probably did not realize they were showing. His analysis was so accurate and detailed that several of the bikers began to look uncomfortable, realizing that this quiet stranger could see right through the tough image they worked so hard to maintain. But the psychological assault was just beginning. The former SEAL began to explain to them exactly what would happen if they chose to continue their aggressive behavior. He described combat techniques with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather, making it clear that he possessed knowledge and skills that could end the confrontation in ways they did not want to imagine. "I could disable 3 of you before the rest even realized what was happening," he said matter-of-factly. "The human body has several points where applied pressure can cause unconsciousness in under 10 seconds. I know where every one of those points is located, and I have had 20 years of practice using that knowledge." The gang leader, who had seemed so intimidating just minutes before, found himself taking an involuntary step backward. His mouth had gone dry, and sweat was beginning to form on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Everything about this situation had gone wrong, and he was beginning to understand that he and his crew were completely out of their depth. The retired SEAL continued his psychological dismantling of the motorcycle gang. He explained that real warriors protect those who cannot protect themselves, while bullies and cowards pick on helpless victims like the injured dog lying a few feet away. His words struck home because they were delivered without anger or emotion, just cold, hard truth that the bikers could not argue with or dismiss. "Every single one of you is bigger and stronger than that little dog," the Navy SEAL said, his voice carrying a note of disgust for the first time. "It takes no courage or skill to hurt something that cannot fight back. Any real man would be ashamed of what you did here today." The psychological pressure was having its intended effect. Several of the younger gang members were now hanging their heads, unable to meet the stranger's steady gaze. They had joined the motorcycle club because they wanted to feel powerful and respected. But this man was showing them that what they had been doing was the exact opposite of strength or honor. The gang leader realized that his authority over the group was crumbling before his eyes. Men who had followed him without question for years were now looking uncertain and ashamed. The reputation and fear that had taken him years to build was being destroyed by a quiet man in glasses who had not even raised his voice. "Look," the leader said, his voice now much quieter and less confident than before. "Maybe we got a little carried away with the dog. We did not mean any real harm." The Navy SEAL fixed him with a stare that made the massive biker feel like a child being scolded by his father. "You meant to cause pain and suffering to an innocent creature for your own entertainment. That is exactly what you meant to do, and now you are going to make it right." The gang leader was just raising his massive fist to deliver what he expected would be the first of many punches when the quiet stranger did something completely unexpected. Instead of trying to defend himself or backing away from the threat, the man calmly reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. The movement was so casual and unthreatening that it caught all the bikers off guard. "Before this goes any further, you might want to know who you are dealing with," the man said in the same steady voice he had been using throughout the confrontation. He opened his wallet and pulled out what looked like an identification card, holding it out toward the gang leader. The massive biker looked confused by this strange turn of events, but his curiosity got the better of him. He snatched the identification from the stranger's hand, expecting to see a driver's license or credit card that he could use to mock the man before beating him senseless. But when he looked down at what he was holding, his expression changed completely. The color drained from the gang leader's face as he read the information on the card. His hands, which had been steady and threatening just moments before, began to shake slightly as he realized what he was looking at. The identification was not just any ordinary card. It was military identification that told a story the bikers were not prepared to hear. The quiet man standing before them was not a retired teacher or office worker as they had assumed. According to the identification in the leader's trembling hands, he was a retired Navy SEAL with over 20 years of active service. The card listed deployments to some of the most dangerous places on Earth, where he had been sent to handle situations that regular soldiers could not manage. But that was not all. The identification also showed that since his retirement from active military service, the man had been working as a combat instructor, teaching advanced fighting techniques to police officers and military personnel. He held black belts in multiple martial arts and was certified in weapons training that most people had never even heard of. The gang leader looked up from the identification card to stare at the man who was still standing calmly in front of him. Suddenly, the stranger's relaxed posture and steady breathing took on a completely different meaning. What the bikers had mistaken for weakness was actually the controlled calm of someone who had faced much more dangerous situations than a parking lot confrontation with a motorcycle gang. "Pass it around," the quiet man said, nodding toward the identification card. "Make sure everyone gets a good look." The gang leader, his voice now much quieter than before, handed the card to the biker standing next to him. One by one, the identification was passed around the circle, and with each pair of eyes that read it, the atmosphere in the parking lot changed dramatically. The confident swagger that had defined the group just minutes earlier began to evaporate as they realized they had made a terrible mistake. The bikers began to look at each other with uncertainty and growing fear. They were used to intimidating regular people who had no training in violence or combat, but now they found themselves face to face with someone who had spent decades learning how to neutralize threats much more dangerous than a motorcycle gang. Stories they had heard about Navy SEALs began to run through their minds, tales of incredible skills and training that seemed almost superhuman. The quiet man waited patiently while his identification made its way around the circle. He seemed completely relaxed, as if he were waiting in line at a grocery store, rather than surrounded by 12 angry bikers who had been planning to attack him. His breathing remained steady, and his hands stayed loose at his sides. But now the bikers were beginning to understand that this casual stance was the position of someone who could explode into action faster than they could react. When the identification card finally made its way back to the gang leader, he held it out toward the stranger with a hand that was noticeably less steady than before. The dynamic in the parking lot had shifted completely. The bikers were no longer the predators in this situation. They had become the prey, trapped by their own aggression, and facing someone whose skills and experience far exceeded anything they could imagine. The retired Navy SEAL took his identification back and returned it to his wallet with the same calm movements he had used throughout the entire confrontation. Then he looked around at each of the bikers, his eyes meeting theirs one by one, and they could see in his gaze the kind of confidence that only comes from knowing exactly what you are capable of doing when the situation requires it. The quiet man walked right up to the edge of the circle where the bikers were still kicking the injured dog. His approach was so calm and silent that none of the gang members noticed him until he spoke. When his voice cut through their laughter and cruel comments, it was steady and clear, with no trace of fear or anger despite what he had just witnessed. "Stop hurting that animal and leave this place right now," he said in a tone that was polite but firm, as if he were asking them to move their car from a parking space rather than confronting a dozen dangerous men who outweighed him by hundreds of pounds. The bikers stopped what they were doing and turned to stare at this ordinary-looking man who had just given them an order. For a moment, there was complete silence in the parking lot as they tried to process what had just happened. Then, one by one, they began to laugh, but their laughter was different now, darker and more threatening than when they had been abusing the dog. The leader of the gang, The massive man with the long beard who had delivered the first kick stepped away from the injured animal and moved toward the stranger. His face showed a mixture of amusement and disbelief that someone so obviously outmatched would dare to challenge him and his crew. He was used to people crossing the street to avoid him, not walking up and telling him what to do. "Did you just tell us what to do, old man?" the leader asked, his voice growing louder with each word. "Do you have any idea who you are talking to? Do you know what we do to people who stick their nose where it does not belong?" The other bikers began to form a wider circle, now including the quiet stranger in the center along with the injured dog. They were experienced in intimidation tactics and knew how to use their size and numbers to make people back down. Several of them cracked their knuckles and rolled their shoulders, making sure the stranger could see exactly how outmatched he was. But the man in the glasses did not seem impressed or frightened by their display. He stood perfectly still, his hands at his sides, looking directly at the gang leader without blinking or backing away. His voice remained calm and steady when he responded to the threats. "I am someone who does not like to see innocent creatures being hurt by cowards," he said, and his words hit the bikers like a slap in the face. "And I am asking you one more time to stop what you are doing and leave." The gang leader's face turned red with anger at being called a coward in front of his crew. In his world, respect and fear were everything. And this nobody in glasses had just challenged his authority in the worst possible way. He took several steps closer to the stranger, using his height advantage to loom over him in a way that had terrified countless people in the past. "You picked the wrong day to play hero, Grandpa," the leader snarled, his hands curling into fists the size of hammers. "We are going to teach you what happens when you mess with people like us. Maybe after we are done with you, we will go back to having some fun with your little dog friend over there." The other bikers moved closer, sensing that violence was about to explode in the parking lot. They had been in situations like this many times before, and they knew how it usually ended. Some fool would try to stand up to them, and they would put him in the hospital as an example to anyone else who might get similar ideas. It was just another Sunday morning that was about to turn ugly. But the quiet man still showed no sign of backing down or running away. If anything, he seemed to become even calmer as the situation grew more dangerous. He adjusted his glasses slightly and looked around at all 12 of the bikers who were now surrounding him, as if he were counting them and making some kind of calculation in his head. Inside the restaurant, customers were frantically calling the police on their cell phones, but everyone knew that help would not arrive in time to prevent whatever was about to happen in the parking lot. They could only watch and hope that somehow this brave but seemingly helpless man would survive his attempt to save the little dog that had brought so much joy to their quiet Sunday mornings. Among all the horrified customers watching the terrible scene through the restaurant windows, there was one man who had been sitting quietly in the corner booth throughout the entire morning. He had arrived early, before the breakfast rush, and had been enjoying his coffee and pancakes while reading a book. Unlike the other customers who were now standing and pointing at the window, this man remained seated, but his entire body had gone completely still. At first glance, there was nothing particularly remarkable about him. He appeared to be in his early 50s, with graying hair that was neatly combed and a clean-shaven face that showed the lines of someone who had lived through many experiences. He was wearing simple blue jeans and a plain white t-shirt, the kind of ordinary clothes that would make him blend into any crowd without being noticed. His build was average, not too tall or too short, not obviously muscular but not soft either. He wore wire-rimmed glasses that gave him the appearance of a teacher or an office worker, someone who spent his days working with papers and computers rather than with his hands. To anyone looking at him casually, he would have seemed like the least likely person in the restaurant to confront a gang of dangerous bikers. But there was something in his eyes as he watched the abuse of the innocent dog that should have served as a warning to anyone who knew how to read such signs. Behind his glasses, his eyes had gone completely cold, the kind of coldness that comes not from lack of feeling, but from too much control over very strong emotions. His jaw was set in a hard line, and his hands, which had been casually holding his coffee cup, were now gripping it so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. The man slowly closed his book and placed it on the table beside his plate. He took one last sip of his coffee, as if he were making a decision about something much more important than finishing his breakfast. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and left enough money on the table to cover his bill plus a generous tip for Sarah, who was still standing by the window with tears in her eyes. As he stood up from his booth, several other customers noticed him for the first time. There was something about the way he moved, with deliberate and controlled steps, that made people look twice. He was not rushing toward the door like someone who was panicked or angry. Instead, he walked with the calm, measured pace of someone who had made up his mind about what needed to be done and was prepared to do it. The man paused at the door for just a moment, looking back at the other customers in the restaurant. His expression was calm, almost gentle, as if he were apologizing in advance for what they were about to witness. Then he pushed open the door and stepped outside into the parking lot, where the bikers were still tormenting the helpless dog. The morning air carried the sounds of the animal's whimpering and the cruel laughter of the gang members who were enjoying their sport. The man walked steadily across the parking lot, his footsteps making no sound on the pavement. He moved like someone who had spent years learning how to approach dangerous situations without drawing attention to himself until the exact moment when he chose to act. Behind him, through the restaurant windows, customers watched with a mixture of fear and hope. They could see that this ordinary-looking man was about to confront 12 dangerous bikers who had already shown that they enjoyed hurting defenseless creatures. Most of the people watching expected to see him get beaten up or worse, but something about his calm confidence made a few of them wonder if there might be more to this quiet stranger than met the eye. The man was now only a few steps away from the circle of bikers who were still focused on their cruel game. None of them had noticed his approach yet, too caught up in their entertainment to pay attention to their surroundings. In just a few seconds, he would announce his presence, and everyone would discover whether this unlikely hero had what it took to save the innocent dog from its tormentors. What happened next would be burned into the memory of everyone who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. The little brown and white dog approached the group of bikers with his tail wagging, just as he had approached hundreds of other visitors to the parking lot over the past few weeks. His brown eyes looked up at them with the same hopeful expression he had shown to everyone else, completely trusting and innocent. The dog stopped a few feet away from the nearest biker and sat down politely, just as he had learned to do with other customers. His tail continued to wag against the pavement, making a soft brushing sound that should have melted the heart of anyone with even a small amount of kindness. He tilted his head slightly to one side, as if asking permission to come closer, his entire body language showing nothing but gentleness and hope. For a moment, it seemed like maybe the bikers would simply ignore the little animal and go about their business. But then the leader of the group noticed what was happening, and his face twisted into an ugly expression of disgust and anger. Instead of seeing a harmless creature looking for friendship, he saw an opportunity to show his power and cruelty. Without any warning, the massive man lifted his heavy leather boot and kicked the little dog hard in the ribs. The sound of his boot connecting with the animal's small body was like a gunshot in the quiet morning air. The dog let out a sharp cry of pain and surprise, a sound so heartbreaking that several people inside the restaurant gasped and covered their mouths in horror. The little dog stumbled backward, his legs shaking from the shock and pain of the unexpected attack. His tail, which had been wagging with hope just seconds before, now tucked between his legs as he tried to understand what had just happened to him. His trusting brown eyes now showed confusion and fear as he looked up at the man who had hurt him for no reason at all. But the cruelty was far from over. Another biker, encouraged by his leader's example, stepped forward and delivered another vicious kick to the small animal. This time the dog yelped even louder and tried to crawl away. But his injured body was not moving as well as it should. The other members of the gang began to laugh and cheer, treating the suffering of an innocent creature as if it were some kind of entertainment. The bikers formed a loose circle around the terrified dog, trapping him so he could not escape their abuse. One after another, they took turns kicking the helpless animal, each blow accompanied by cruel laughter and encouraging words from the others. The dog tried desperately to find a way out of the circle, but everywhere he turned, another boot was waiting to hurt him. Inside the restaurant, customers watched in complete shock and horror. Children began to cry as they saw the terrible scene unfolding outside their window. Parents tried to shield their kids from seeing more, but the sounds of the dog's cries were impossible to block out. Several adults stood up from their tables, clearly wanting to do something to help, but the intimidating size and number of the bikers made them hesitate. Sarah, the waitress, had tears streaming down her face as she watched the little dog she had been feeding for weeks being tortured by these monsters. Her hands shook as she reached for the phone to call the police, but she knew that by the time help arrived, it might be too late for the small animal that had brought so much joy to everyone who worked at the restaurant. The dog had stopped trying to run and was now lying on his side, whimpering softly as the bikers continued their assault. His small body was shaking with pain and terror, and it seemed like his spirit was finally being broken by the senseless cruelty of these men who found pleasure in hurting something that could not fight back. The peaceful Sunday morning was suddenly torn apart by a sound that made everyone in the restaurant look up from their coffee cups. A deep, thunderous rumbling filled the air, growing louder and louder until it seemed to shake the very walls of the building. The gentle conversations stopped as customers turned toward the windows to see what was causing the noise that had destroyed their quiet morning. Through the glass, they could see a line of motorcycles turning into the parking lot. Not just one or two bikes, but a whole group of them, their chrome pipes gleaming in the morning sun as they roared toward the restaurant. The sound of 12 powerful engines revving and backfiring echoed off the buildings around them, announcing their arrival to everyone within several blocks. The motorcycles were massive machines, mostly Harley-Davidson bikes that looked like they had been built for intimidation rather than simple transportation. Each bike was customized with extra chrome, oversized engines, and exhaust pipes that seemed designed to make as much noise as possible. The riders guided their machines into parking spaces with practiced ease, but even when they shut off the engines, the silence that followed felt heavy and uncomfortable. The men climbing off the motorcycles looked exactly like what people expected when they thought of a motorcycle gang. They were all wearing black leather jackets covered with patches and symbols that marked them as members of a club that most people would rather avoid. Their arms were covered with tattoos that told stories of violence and rebellion, and their faces showed the hard lines of men who had lived rough lives on the road. The leader of the group was easy to identify. He was taller than the others and built like a professional wrestler, with arms that looked like they could crush bones without much effort. His beard was long and unkempt, reaching nearly to his belt, and his eyes had the cold look of someone who enjoyed causing fear in others. The patches on his jacket showed that he held a high rank in whatever organization they belonged to. As the bikers gathered in the parking lot, their loud voices and rough laughter replaced the peaceful quiet that had filled the air just moments before. They were clearly not the type of customers that Denny's usually served on Sunday mornings. These were men who lived by different rules and had no interest in fitting into polite society. Inside the restaurant, customers began to feel uncomfortable. Families with small children looked nervously toward the door, wondering if they should finish their breakfast quickly and leave. The elderly couple in the corner booth whispered to each other about whether they should ask for their check. Even Sarah, the waitress who had seen all kinds of customers over the years, felt her stomach tighten as she watched the group through the window. The bikers seemed to be in no hurry to come inside. They stood around their motorcycles, lighting cigarettes and talking in voices loud enough to be heard through the glass. Their conversation was filled with curse words and crude jokes that made the families inside glad their children could not hear what was being said. But it was not just the human customers who had noticed the arrival of the motorcycle gang. The little brown and white dog, who had been resting peacefully in his sunny spot near the front of the building, had also heard the loud engines and seen the intimidating group of men gathering just a few feet away from where he lay. The dog did what he had always done when new people arrived at the restaurant. His tail began to wag slowly, and he lifted his head to get a better look at the newcomers. In his simple understanding of the world, new people sometimes meant new opportunities for food or kindness. He had no way of knowing that these particular visitors were very different from the gentle customers who usually shared their breakfast with him. Slowly, hopefully, the little dog stood up and began walking toward the group of bikers, his tail wagging with the same trusting friendliness he showed to everyone who came to his parking lot home. The sun was just beginning to warm the streets of downtown Memphis on what seemed like any other peaceful Sunday morning. Golden rays of light filtered through the glass windows of Denny's restaurant, casting long shadows across the nearly empty dining room. The breakfast rush had come and gone hours earlier, leaving behind only the gentle sounds of coffee cups clinking against saucers and the quiet conversations of a few remaining customers who were in no hurry to start their day. Sarah, the morning waitress, moved slowly between the tables with a fresh pot of coffee. She had been working the Sunday shift for 3 years now and knew exactly how these quiet mornings went. The regulars would nurse their coffee for hours, reading newspapers or simply staring out the window at the world going by. It was the kind of peaceful atmosphere that made her job feel more like visiting with old friends than actual work. Outside in the parking lot, a small brown and white dog made his daily rounds searching for breakfast. The little mutt had become a familiar sight to everyone who worked at the restaurant. Nobody knew exactly when he had first appeared, but it seemed like he had always been there. His fur was a mixture of colors that suggested he came from no particular breed. Just a mix of whatever dogs had come before him. The dog was clearly living on the streets. His coat was matted and dirty from sleeping wherever he could find shelter. His ribs showed through his thin fur, telling the story of too many missed meals and not enough kindness from the world. But despite his rough appearance, there was something gentle in his brown eyes that made people want to help him. Maria, the cook, had been the first to start leaving scraps for the little dog. She would save bits of bacon or leftover pancakes from orders that came back to the kitchen. At first, she had been worried that feeding him would get her in trouble with the manager, but when she mentioned it to him, he just shrugged and said as long as the dog stayed outside and did not bother customers, he did not see any harm in it. Soon, other employees joined in helping the stray. The busboy would save pieces of toast that customers left behind. Even some of the regular customers had started bringing small treats when they came for their morning coffee. The dog seemed to understand that these people were trying to help him, and he never caused any problems or acted aggressively toward anyone. The little dog had developed a routine over the weeks he had been living in the parking lot. He would wake up early and make his rounds, checking all the usual spots where kind people might have left food for him. He never begged or bothered anyone, but would simply sit at a polite distance and wait to see if anyone might share a bite of their breakfast. During the hottest part of the day, he would find shade under one of the cars in the parking lot and rest until evening. When the sun started to set, he would make another round looking for dinner scraps before finding a safe place to sleep for the night. It was not much of a life, but it was survival, and the dog seemed grateful for whatever small kindnesses came his way. The customers inside the restaurant had grown fond of watching the little dog through the windows. Children would point him out to their parents and ask if they could take him home. Adults would smile when they saw him successfully find a dropped piece of food or drink water from the small bowl that someone had placed near the back door. This Sunday morning was starting out just like all the others. The dog had already made his first round and found some leftover biscuit that Maria had left for him near the dumpster. Now he was resting in a sunny spot near the front of the building, his tail occasionally wagging at customers who walked past him on their way into the restaurant. Inside, the peaceful atmosphere continued as people enjoyed their leisurely Sunday breakfast, completely unaware that this quiet morning was about to be shattered by events that would change everything for the little dog and everyone who had come to care about him.